All right. Hello and welcome to Between the Liars with Ryan, Josh,
Hello, hello, hello.
Marcelo,
Hello, everyone.
and Austin. Oh, you're muted, Austin.
Very strong start. How's it going, everybody?
All right, there we go. And today we're going to be covering Biden's recent vaccine mandate. We're going to talk about, we'll give you an overview. We'll talk about the constitutionality, the enforcement, our projected outcomes, and then the hot takes. But before that, we've got a few announcements to bring you, and I'll turn that over to Austin.
All right, so to start off our announcements, we wanted to let everyone know that we are all over social media. You can go and find us on Instagram, travel to our Facebook page, find us on Twitter, and of course, you can find us on our YouTube channel by searching Between the Liars, where we'll be posting some of these live streams.
Yeah, we actually have, along with this stream, coming up on October 2nd, noon Central. So keep an eye on that, and you can access that between our Facebook page or our YouTube channel. If you come and engage on our live stream, we'll be able to live respond to your comments and engage with you all, take any questions you have. And I'm sure, even some of the input you all might have will be like wonderful and add some great points of conversation for us. So we would gladly, have you here, and, would hope you come and join us.
And on that note, I think it's important to address the elephant in the room, which will be that if you follow our YouTube videos and or our live streams, you will be ahead of schedule. You will be keeping up with us live with whatever we're covering that week. If you are following along on podcasts, what we did, trying to be smart, going into this, since we know that we're busy and we didn't want to hold people up with our wonderful content, was we had a reserve of around 3 to 4 episodes. So every Monday, what you're going to see is a drop of an episode that was recorded a couple of weeks ago. I've actually been very impressed with how current and relevant that stayed, and that stuff hasn't really changed in the time between when we've recorded, edited, and dropped it. But if you're interested in keeping up with us live, you will be ahead of schedule, just to note that. So take your pick. You can see us live and in person on YouTube and Facebook, like Josh mentioned, or you can just listen to the beautifully edited versions on podcasts. So with that, we'll head over to the overview, and I'll give it over to Marcelo.
Yes, so what are we talking about today is the Biden vaccine mandate. Basically, what Biden announced a while ago, which is that he is encouraging, actually mandating, that it's the Department of Labor to make people vaccinate for all businesses with 100 or more employees. And what the consequence of, if you don't follow this is that businesses will be fined $14,000 per incident of non-compliance. So this is mainly targeted towards the private sector, as far as we're concerned, because we already mandated vaccines for federal employees. So they have all of that pretty much covered. He's trying to target the private companies, the bigger private companies with a lot of employees, so they get vaccinated, citing the health risk of people who've been unvaccinated and still going to work.
Does anybody have anything to add to kind of that overview before we kind of move on to more of our discussion base? Go ahead, Josh.
Well, in addition to that, some of the technicalities of this order is how it targeted some workplaces. So it also targeted, there was a workplace cap of 100 people that Biden put on. We also looked explicitly at people who do contracting with the federal government, because there's a lot of smaller like software firms and other firms and that don't have that employee threshold. So we also put that requirement of, if you do business at all that contracts with the federal government, you'll need to have these same policies as a way to like further extend the impact of his order.
There's a lot that's not really known at the moment on how this will be carried out. We do know that President Biden has passed this through executive order that has gone through the Department of Labor and is going to be enforced by OSHA. What we don't know is exactly how this will fall to the businesses. So, for example, you have the choice to either have your employees be vaccinated or test weekly. One question that comes to mind for me is how or who rather will be paying for those tests, because like those can run up to $50 at times depending on where you're getting them from and the type of test that's going through. That can get pretty hefty, and if it starts cutting into the profit margins, it can either lead to damage to the business's profit margins, their ability to stay afloat, or it might be pushed off to employees. That much is not clear on where that will fall or who's going to kind of suffer the bill, so to speak.
I'm very excited to announce that I have a free option, an alternative, instead of getting tested weekly or bi-weekly. It's called the vaccine, available in your nearest CVS.
All right. So I think that can allow us to go on to the enforcement. Like I mentioned, OSHA, the Occupation Safety and Health Administration, which is a branch of the federal government or is appointed by the president, they will be the ones enforcing this. They can fine and collect on those fines up to $14,000 per incident.
I think what will be interesting is seeing like how OSHA becomes aware of its enforcement, because a lot of times with with OSHA violations, it's impossible to have enough federal employees to audit things with a huge amount of success. There's so many job sites in America, and so obviously we don't spend that much money on auditors. So imagine there will be a large part up to employees to report, hey, our workplace isn't implementing these rules. Same as and unfortunately, the case with OSHA is like you have to report a lot of workplace safety violations in general yourself, especially at like construction and other more manual labor oriented places.
I think that's a good point, Josh, that this, while it's enforced by OSHA, it's also kind of regulated by the employees. So if you file that incident report, that can kind of be up to you and the employer, which means that if a business, for instance, just chooses not to report these instances and kind of not to comply, so to speak, unless OSHA, comes in and decides that that's what they want to do, is enforce that, then you're not going to see really anything come of this. So OSHA has a very broad scope to choose kind of what they would like to enforce and what they would like to kind of let slide by in this instance.
I think there's also a converse point there of like, if you had a very close-knit place of work, and admittedly that's hard to do at 100+ employee facility, but on paper, until you got randomly audited by OSHA, and that is something that happens, same as the health inspector may occasionally show up, an OSHA auditor may occasionally show up and be like, hey, can I, walk around your workplace and make sure you're, complying with federal regulations? I've seen that happen. Welcomed it because, they're there to keep people safe. But theoretically, if no one talked and everyone was in agreement and that's what they wanted their own workplace to be, they might be able to fly under the radar for a minute of it. Now, I do imagine, you getting up to 100 people, you're going to start having a pretty diverse amount of opinions. Statistical sampling tells us as well, you start getting a lot of people together, you're going to start seeing a lot, more and more variances of how they view things.
I think it's also important to note that the executive order that was passed by President Biden, when it went through the Department of Labor, it was under the emergency temporary standards. That was why he passed this, why he said, I have to pass it through executive order. Congress isn't doing this fast enough. In a sense, he's evoking a state of emergency. And this is what we're potentially going to see battling out in the courts is, was this an appropriate use of executive powers? It is important to note that if the order that was issued doesn't meet the emergency temporary standards, then the argument here will be it should have gone through the legislator, strike it down, try again through Senate and the rest of Congress, and actually have that be passed through. So there's kind of multiple layers to this. Number one, is it constitutional for the federal government to actually be able to kind of from the top down mandate this to happen? Was it appropriate for President Biden to do it in this way? And can it even be addressed by the courts? So I think that can kind of move us on to the constitutionality here, which we can start talking about. So for me, I'll kick this off by saying I have kind of a two-part concern, or if I'm representing the side of the constitutionality. Number one, we need to answer the question, can President Biden mandate health legislation at the federal level? We've seen instances like this happen, such as when President Trump went ahead and closed the country right after we were getting into the worst parts of COVID back in 2020. The second part of this is, does OSHA have the constitutional power to enforce this? So I'll kick that over to you guys to kind of start where you want.
I think my first gut reaction would be to say that I understand the constitutionality argument and why we want to check out basically, like, is it good or not that this is actually happening, and like in the way that it's happening. But while I understand that there might be a disagreement on like the way it's been implemented, I will say that I am very happy that it has been implemented. There's way too many places with a lot of workers, and if they're not requiring vaccinations, I feel like they should. I don't, and I will carry this throughout the entire conversation if I have to, is that vaccines are good, and more people with vaccines, it's a good thing.
Now, Austin, what are your initial thoughts on this?
I think a lot of the conversation around, the vaccine mandate itself, it's been misconstrued by a lot of people as taking a side against the vaccine itself, which I think I'd speak for everyone in this group right here that we're all, it is a thing that works. It is a good thing. And, if you're able to take it medically, if you're able to take it if it doesn't conflict with religious things that you would have against taking it, for instance, then you should take it. It's a very good thing. With that being said, though, the question, I guess it's just two separate questions. Is the vaccine good? Can or should Biden have mandated this at the federal level? So anyways, just to preface this conversation, vaccine is a good thing if you're eligible to take it. And if you want to take it, you should definitely take it.
I would say when we look at the idea of the short-term emergency authorization, I think a pandemic epidemic definitely fits that criterion of this isn't something we're expecting to be like long-term. So this isn't something like a medicine someone's going to have to take for the rest of their lives. And so I do think it fits that definition of emergency short-term use. I also think it's worth like considering of like what we expect the president to do and what we expect our government to act and how what actions we want them to take. At this point of the pandemic, 1 in 500 Americans, 1 in 500 have died from the coronavirus. And this is one of the largest mass casualty events since the World Wars. And I think that's something that makes us, look at what type of, response and what degree of a response we expect from our government to take. So, yeah.
Josh, I think that that's a good point that's raised. I think that's important to consider. I also think that at this point, we're in a little bit of a different position than we were, especially at the beginning of COVID. We've got more certainty. We know where we're at with the vaccine. I think the main problem right now that we're facing is trying to get those who are vaccine hesitant or just flat out don't want to take it, period, getting them on board with this. At this point, I think I can pretty safely say that anybody who wants the vaccine has gotten it at this point. We've had enough time. It's been authorized for enough people. It now has FDA approval since our last episode over the vaccine passports. So you're not looking at quite the same level of a state of emergency. And so to me, that's where I start having more of an issue with the severe action, so to speak, that's taking place, particularly with how it's going to affect businesses, especially the small and mid-sized businesses.
I think my counterpoint to that would be is if this does go on and this does continue, it will re-enter a state of crisis. If it already has in it, like a lot of the southern states, like there's stories like where a man in Alabama was having a cardiac event. He went to 43 different hospitals and was turned away because none of them were going to be able to treat him because they were entirely full with coronavirus patients. And the man died, and he didn't need to. There could have been medicine available for him, but we're so overwhelmed trying to manage the current wave of coronavirus patients. And for some states, that's still getting worse. And there's on top of this, as long as the virus keeps spreading and mutating, we risk losing what we have gained with our vaccines. The Delta variant is already a more spreadable variant, even if it isn't a more deadly variant. But the more times and times the virus is alive, the more it evolves, and the more it can pose a threat of getting around our vaccines or becoming so destructive to the body that it overwhelms our vaccines rather than even just getting around it.
I would say that a lot of the conversation that we've had, even in this show too, before, has been like, are we still in a state of crisis? And are we still in a state of emergency to justify the action that the government is taking? And I will say yes. I will agree with Josh here, because we were seeing the numbers rise of COVID cases. The chart indicates that like we're getting to levels right now that we haven't seen since the previous winter, which was devastating. And we're going to get there because of Delta, because it's more contagious, because it's more deadly. And the speed that we have to take for this cannot be understated. Like, we need to take action now. And I feel like we can talk about educating people in a bit for sure, but like, we need to do something to get people vaccinated now.
I think that ties in nicely to our earlier point about how the people that we're struggling to reach right now are those who are vaccine hesitant or just refusing to take the vaccine. And you can see that Biden's action here is targeted towards those people specifically. And the people who are at most at risk, where the numbers of deaths are predominantly coming from, are those who are not vaccinated. So in a sense, this is an effort to try to get those people in a position to where they're not still the people who are at high risk if and when they get sick. And so it's mandating this. So to me, this is what ties into the constitutional problem, is if the legislator was to pass this, we'd be having a completely different conversation. I think it's the fact that it's by executive order that this winds up being a real question of, and particularly scrutinizing whether or not the state of emergencies require that. Because in theory, executive orders should not be usurping the governmental powers from top down unless necessary.
So I'm going to pitch this to Austin. Do you think this top-down, like more authoritarian approach is going to cause people to become more hesitant? Because I've heard that a lot from people, that this move by the government could make the kind of conspiracy theories seem more legitimate.
I would agree with that. I think that particularly since it is coming from such a strong, centralized, top-down decree, I think that it's going to be interpreted in a way that isn't going to make people get over their vaccine hesitancy.
I think that'll be particularly reflected in, and let's say that I am a business owner or I am an employee in this case who buys into that. Now I'm just, in my opinion, incentivized to not report and not comply. So we haven't really done anything, and we've wind up increasing the legitimacy of the claims that Biden is being authoritarian and totalitarian, the way that he's doing things, and I can still resist him in that way.
It seems to me that the more effective track, just like with anything else related to science or medicine, would just be more transparency and honesty about what to expect going forward from the vaccine itself and from the Delta variant and future variants. I think there was, particularly around the end of 2020, there was a lot of thoughts of like, okay, everyone gets the vaccine, the disease disappears just overnight. That's probably not what's going to happen. That doesn't seem to be the current trend of thinking among experts and where we think things are, or where people think things are going to go. It definitely attenuates symptoms. It reduces the severity of disease, and the vaccines are very good at keeping people from passing away, but it definitely won't just make the virus disappear. That's great points for the vaccine. That's an awesome thing. But I think the misplaced expectations have also contributed to a lot of vaccine hesitancy, as far as seeing like, oh, well, that person got the vaccine, they still got it. What's the deal with that? Transparency on the front end could have mitigated some of those things, because people shouldn't expect to not get the disease if you have the vaccine. You can still catch it. But that wasn't the point of the vaccine in the first place. It was to attenuate the symptoms that you would get from catching it after being vaccinated.
One of my, and we're not there at hot takes yet, but one of my hottest takes is the idea of me trying to understand the point of view of people who don't want to take the vaccine. And it's this idea that, Austin, you mentioned, that like hesitancy of like, if I tell them you should take the vaccine and it's going to work, they don't believe me. And if I tell them, take the vaccine and it might work, then they're going to say, well, why would I take it if it might not work? So it's been, and I'm laughing, and it's obviously it's not a laughing matter, but I hope you understand the frustration that we've seen with like all of the disinformation that's going on in the media, and even like famous people that I will not mention here, that are talking about like their family members who have extreme cases, and in this scenario, they're just lying, and nothing that people's like a scientist can come out and say something, and if they don't believe them, and nothing will.
It's definitely a hard road to navigate, because the well has been so poisoned for the past, well, since the pandemic started. So honestly, I don't know how large centralized organizations and authorities gain their credibility back, considering how much things have changed over the past year. And as we brought up in previous podcasts, to a certain degree, that is how the scientific method works. Of course, as we get more information, things change. But a lot of the declarations that have been made over the past were made in a way that sounded more concrete than they should have been, if that makes sense. They were always tentative, which should be an understanding going into the conversation. But what you hear from the TV is, that message did not come across at any point, which I think has been kind of a fumble, which is not a good thing because it's led to a lot of terrible outcomes.
Yeah, we actually had a conversation pretty similar to this idea actually just yesterday in my health communication class. And I can promise you there is a lot of research about the coronavirus messaging and governmental responses that's going to flood health communication journals for the next few years. And it was something that we brought up of like, when we're looking at how the government at first responded to the vaccine, and Dr. Fauci came out and said, I'm not sure, I don't know if we need masks. I can't make that recommendation yet. And there was a lot of common sense to infer that we were probably going to need to have, and wear masks because it was a respiratory virus. And that's what all, coronaviruses are. It shares similarities with SARS, which also was greatly mitigated in parts of Asia through mask wearing. And almost there was a dedication to the scientific method that may have been a little bit harmful to getting people around because even people respond this way to the flu vaccine. They say, well, the flu vaccine only gets a couple of the strands of the flu going around. So, why should I bother getting it? There's part of, I definitely can see what, with Marcel here and saying like, there'd be that kind of same response. But I also, think there's a danger of being overconfident, then being wrong. And then everyone's just like, you lied and we're wrong. And is that worse than being unsure in the long term? We're seeing that kind of played out live.
Okay, I'll concede some ground there. Like I was a little upset. Well, maybe not upset is not the right word, but when they sort of flip-flopped on the idea of mask wearing and how effective it was, I almost felt like a little too righteous in wearing masks from the beginning, and then I was like, well, actually, it doesn't do that much. And even now that I'm fully vaccinated, and should I wear a mask? Am I being more protected? Less protected? Am I better for wearing a mask? It's still honestly unsure. So sure, I think that they could have done a much better job with that messaging.
Well, even with the speech that we're kind of pulling most of this information from as far as what exactly his executive order is going to entail, President Biden does spew some anti-scientific rhetoric in that he winds up saying that we as the vaccinated are frustrated with the unvaccinated because you're putting us at risk, when in reality, the data says that you are incredibly low risk, particularly if you're not in the upper age brackets, to where 75% of the cases that we've had that have been breakthrough cases have been 65 or older. Again, like Austin mentioned earlier, that's not to say that you're not at risk, period, but rather when he seems to on the one hand say that this is so problematic for us who have the vaccine that I have to issue this emergency order, and on the other hand says, but go get the vaccine. I think that definitely feeds into the anti-scientific rhetoric and continues to make people even more hesitant to get the vaccine, which goes against the entire purpose of what he's doing here.
I don't know. There's something to be said about people who can't get the vaccine through a variety of medical conditions, or people who have the vaccine, but because of, compounding medical conditions, whether they're in control of those conditions or not, we don't usually use that metric for medical, care. It's like we don't turn away patients who are unvaccinated, even though they could have prevented their condition. So if someone's comorbidities are caused by their own choices, that isn't going to play into effect of whether or not and how we triage care. We triage care based on your probability of making it. But there is something to be said about people who are immunocompromised can't get the vaccine, children who are still too young to get the vaccine. Are being put at this exposed risk and losing access to their freedoms and to society because of the very severe threat this virus still poses to them. People should be able to go to Walmart and get their groceries without having to be afraid they're going to die of a virus. And for probably several hundred thousand, several million Americans, that's still true. And I think the president's right to speak up on their behalf and take their side on this issue.
I can move on to one of the precedents that they're using in defense for this, if you guys want, or if Austin, Marcel, you guys had any final thoughts before we move on to that section.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. So one of the main cases that I've been hearing in support for why this is constitutional comes from Jacobson versus Massachusetts. So this was a Supreme Court case decided in 1905. And I will read you what their decision said. So it said that the police power of the state embraces such reasonable regulations relating to matters completely within its territory and not affecting the people of other states, established directly by legislative enactment, as will protect the public health and safety. While a local regulation, even if based on the acknowledged police power of a state, must always yield in case of conflict with the exercise by the general government of any power it possesses under the Constitution, the mode or manner of exercising of police power is wholly within the discretion of the state, as long as the Constitution of the United States does not contravene. So what this is saying in a nutshell is that the state governments, because this case was about, can state legislators mandate vaccines at the state level? And this is now trying to be applied to the federal level. One of the main takeaways here is that the state did have the right to mandate that if they thought that that was the case. However, as per the 10th Amendment, it cannot contradict powers that are delegated to the federal government. Thoughts on that?
I can think of a few states that wouldn't pass this mandate and that have actually passed mandates against the idea of a vaccination mandate. So I agree with the principle, and I do think it should stand, especially because the federal government will agree with the federal government. That sounds very simplistic, but I believe that if they follow this line of thinking, the government should be able to mandate the vaccination if necessary. If it's left to the states, I can think of a few that wouldn't pass this or have worked towards not, like actively saying, we're not going to force you to get vaccinated.
So to me, the main issue there is who is executing this order. If it was the state government, I'd be like, great, this actually agrees with this. With the federal government, particularly coming from Biden, I think that even if the federal Senate or the U.S. House had passed this, I would still question whether or not they could mandate this. However, I would defer a little bit more if it wasn't by executive order. Like, again, I think that Biden even says in his speech, part of the reason he's doing this is because of the governors who, like you mentioned, Marcelo, are standing in the way here. And he basically said that he's going to do everything in his power to get them out of the way, which that completely undermines the concept of enumerated powers, the distinction between the governments. In fact, he doesn't have, via the Constitution, the power to do that. So in essence, that needs to be deferred to the state levels. And then whether or not they would actually pass these is a different question.
I think this case and Biden's mandate are, as we would say in debate, two ships passing in the night, meaning they don't really have that much to do to each other. So the Jacobson versus Massachusetts case gives us some contextual evidence of where, like, Americans have consented in the past of like a government agency enforcing vaccines. But I do think there's a couple of like critical differences, of one being the type of mandate that Massachusetts did here, which was basically, as the conspiracy theorists have already accused Biden of doing, like door-to-door police power enforcement of vaccines. And I think, the second, obviously, there's a difference between a state government doing, and in particular here, it's a state legislator doing it. So it's not like the state governor used the state workplace safety agency to do this. So I don't think this really enlightens whether or not OSHA can do this, let alone whether or not the federal government can do it. But that's why I think it leans heavy on the federal government's burden to protect and provide safe workplaces, as laid out by Congress in previous legislation that, delegates the president, not only created OSHA, but gives him the power to give, executive orders over OSHA.
Austin, what are your thoughts on this?
I think the rhetoric is pretty striking. Just to comment on what Biden said, we're going to, or any of the governors that stand in the way, we're basically going to move them out of the way, just to paraphrase. I think that's a little bit striking. Vaccine aside, I think that kind of rhetoric would not only, it should, startle Americans. I certainly don't think it would promote unity, and I don't think it's going to encourage, again, to take it back to people who may be vaccine hesitant who could get the vaccine. I don't think it's going to contribute to them doing what this mandate is wanting them to do. I think it's a little bit defeating to kind of make those sort of, pretty harsh declarations from a central place of power.
What about you, Marcelo?
I already said it, but I'll say it again. If you left it up to the states, we would be in the same position that we are right now. Like all of the blue states, or most of the blue states, would be like, yeah, sure, we'll make people get vaccinated. And some have already done it, like New York's vaccine mandate, California's vaccine mandate in some areas. And then all of the red states would be like, well, we don't care. And we're actually going to. And it's not that they don't care. They actively are working, and they have worked to pass this legislation that is basically telling people that you cannot force your people to get vaccinated, which I think it's even worse.
I've said it before, and I said this in our segment over vaccine passports. I'm obviously not against the vaccine. I'm against it being mandated, but particularly from the top-down level. And one of the main reasons that this is troubling to me is because OSHA is appointed by the president. It is like the head of OSHA, as I've understood it, is appointed by the president of the United States, which means that OSHA is not answerable to the people of the United States. We don't get a say on that. We get a say on who we put into the Senate, who confirms or denies that appointment. But once OSHA is given the power to do something, there is no referendum that the people can have on, say, the upcoming midterm elections. You're stuck with what the president of the United States has chosen to put in there. So once every 4 years, we do have the option to kind of come back from what decisions we liked or didn't like. But at the same time, this is something that is not directly answerable to the people in the same way that your legislators are, which is why it was originally set up to where the legislator would be the one doing this. Because if the people didn't like it, they could recall them, like we saw the attempt the other week for Gavin Newsom, or they could just vote him out in the midterms.
I disagree with that take because of the inherent structure of the U.S. government. Ryan, we're going back to civics. People do have recourse here. They can sue. They can take it to court, and I imagine this is how it's going to be done. Different state governors and their attorney generals will, and private citizens and private business owners may join on and sign on and become plaintiffs in those cases. So yeah, OSHA is appointed by the government, reported by the president, confirmed by our elected representatives who are there to act on our behalf. So we're trusting them with that already. So we have a say over that. And again, we have a say over, we have our say through the court system of whether or not this fits the bill with procedure. So the Americans have a lot more say, I think, than you give them credit for, thanks to the structure of our government having an independent judicial branch.
Well, you've pointed out that there's checks and balances. Of course, that's the case. And that wasn't what my point was that there's no checks and balances, but rather that the reason that this shouldn't be done through executive order is because it wasn't given to President Biden in the first place. And the fact that we as the United States people have to sue in order to get what should have been the correct process is ridiculous. Congress should be doing this. And the point that they are not doing their job, and the president decides that that's his permission to step in on everyone else's behalf and mandate what is and is not in our best interest. That point still stands, though, even though we have a response that we can give, but it's much more difficult.
But isn't it the court who makes it the call of whether or not it's the president's responsibility and not our political philosophies? Realistically, like they'll take an examine of the case law and look at what's there, and they'll consign based on the Constitution, all of the other documents they like looking to, and say, this is within the president's power. If we don't like that, then that really is a call to, overhaul our legislators, because if the court rules it's in the president's power, that's because the legislators throughout the ages have made it that way.
So this actually raises an interesting question, which is the other thing that might make this very difficult and tricky, particularly the way that this is being done. It's the principle of Chevron deference. So I'll read what that is here. It's when a legislative delegation to an administrative agency on a particular issue or question is not explicit, but rather implicit. A court may not substitute its own interpretation of the status for a reasonable interpretation made by the administrative agency. In essence, what this winds up meaning is that if OSHA is given the broad orders that you must enforce this, and then they're given the jurisdiction to do that, if the Supreme Court is to weigh in on this, they're not allowed to make specific inferences because OSHA is in and of itself answerable to itself. They were given a broad mandate. So one of the criticisms here and why this might be difficult for the people to actually sue is because you've got Chevron deference, which the court might choose to uphold and remove themselves entirely, which would remove the check.
It does say, though, on the reasonable interpretation made by the administration agency, and the court will be the one deciding whether or not the interpretation was reasonable. Because in order for them to intervene here and get past this Chevron deference, then they'll have to say, then, you weren't being reasonable in your interpretation, and we're now going to substitute our own. So it is deference, but it's not, it doesn't take away the power of the court by any measure. Should a majority of a federal bench or the Supreme Court decide, this is not correct.
And technically, I think this will probably also go to your point, Josh. The court, while it's, supposed to be non-political, we see it politicized all the time. Therefore, they might choose to weigh in regardless. But if Chevron deference is enacted, then what we will see is that, that can cripple kind of the case that would be brought in that instance.
Don't worry, conservatives. Have faith in your 3-6 stack court.
Marcelo, what are your thoughts on this?
I mean, and it's gonna fall on the other side. I feel the situation, and we've talked about government overreach before when presidents do it and the executive does it, because I have complained about it when Trump was in office, when he was doing things that I didn't like. And now Biden is doing things that I like, and I'm like, yes, please do it more. So I understand the contradiction here, for sure, absolutely. And I'm shameless in admitting that I love that he's doing the mandate because I want people to get vaccinated. Sue me, don't sue me. But yeah, that's like constitutionality is an argument in the weight of execution and the feasibility of the policy passing. And I really have no other thoughts on it other than I wish the Congress wasn't so busy trying to pass another multi-trillion-dollar package that I believe we need. So I'm glad that they're putting in the work. If they could take, I don't know, a few days, it wouldn't take a few days. If they could take some time to pass this too, and then maybe people would complain about it less.
This is shifting us nicely into kind of what we think some of the outcomes could and might be. Austin, what are kind of your last thoughts on the constitutionality before we move on, though?
Just broadly, the mandate itself, to my ears, just does sound a lot more like it would be at home in legislation. We've mentioned it throughout this section, but I do think that, like Marcelo just mentioned, people would be a little bit less freaking out about things if it had been, the very busy Congress that had passed it, as opposed to Biden doing it from a singular seat of power.
Would it be fair to say then that we've basically all agreed that there's constitutional issues, which pretty much guarantees this will be dragged before the courts, but then we have different ideas on whether or not we agree with it happening and its goodness? Is that fair?
I'll add an addendum. It could be perfectly constitutional. Everyone could know it could be perfectly constitutional, and they would still drag it to court, a la the 2020 election. They will sue and make up their own conspiracies when the facts are against them. It doesn't matter anymore.
Is that fair statement, Marcelo, from kind of your last comments then?
Yeah, for sure. I feel like people have gone to court for less, and so I think that I don't really see a world in which our government passes a vaccine mandate and people don't go up in arms about it.
So I'll kick off our outcomes then by talking about how I do think that I don't see a way in which this doesn't get dragged before the courts. And if it can go all the way up to the Supreme Court and they'll hear the case, it'll go there. I can pretty much guarantee that. I think that the grounds for that will likely be, one, the accusation that Biden is overstepping his executive jurisdiction as per the Constitution. I also think that the fact that it's mandated through OSHA, which has much more broad scope than, say, the legislators, and the fact that this was passed through executive order rather than the legislator, I think all of that's going to be hauled before the court, and that'll be their reasoning for doing this.
In terms of other outcomes, what's the group's opinion on the effect on? Because like I want you to expand more on the idea of like how this would be bad for business owners and employers.
Sure, I assume that was directed at me. So the way that I can see this being problematic for business owners is, number one, we're at a vulnerable point right now where people are not really wanting to come back to the office. Restaurants, fast food industries that rely on traffic from people and require staff to keep those up. I can see this causing issues for them getting people to come back in. Either I could see where they start losing profit margins because they can't, unless they choose to fire their employees, really force this to happen, or I could just see them overriding this and then getting into legal trouble with OSHA. But the bottom line, I can see this coming back around to where it's a monetary issue for businesses to enforce this on their employees, and they're put between either paying that or they might have to just start firing people so that they can actually keep it and only have those who are vaccinated.
I have a bit more snark to throw, and it's going to be if you live in a state where your state government isn't still providing you free tests that you can go down to your local health department or any several extra sites they've set up around, then you're also in a state that's probably going to sue the federal government over this vaccine mandate in the first place, and you're probably in a state where less than 50% of the people are vaccinated. So take a hard look at your own state government. If like this is causing problems for your business or for you financially, it's your legislators and your health departments that stopped paying for your tests, while New York, California, and the states the majority of them, the majority of Americans in the metropolitan areas live in, still have access to free tests. So tad bit more snark.
Definitely snark. I think that that's coinciding with Biden's displacement of the blame, as he basically says in his speech that the reason that I have to overstep my constitutional bounds is because you all won't figure this out. And that's just not a reason for him to do this. So this will boil all the way back up to him executing this. Now, the fact that OSHA comes after the states and the states have to pay it, sure, like you said, Josh, I'll agree with that comes down to their personal decisions. But make no mistake, it starts from the top. And the fact that, Biden has done this and overstepped his bounds doesn't undercut. I don't think that your point there undercuts that.
I'll say that I don't really, and this is a preview of my hot take in a few minutes, but living under a capitalistic society where you have to work to eat and survive, I don't know how many people faced with the ultimate choice of like, get this free vaccine that will save your life or quit this job. I don't know how many people will choose the idea of like, yeah, I'll get fired because Biden is an authoritarian. Like I'll quit my job and I'll starve. Like I believe that at the end of the day, the punishment that workers will face if they don't take the vaccine will be hard enough. And maybe this won't happen, but I believe that most people will just take the vaccine, even though they don't believe that it'll be very effective. And so in that way, the outcome will be a positive one. Yes, you'll harm the credibility of people, whatever, but you'll have people with more vaccines, which is what people want, which is what some of us want.
What do you think, Austin?
I think coming out of this, as with most things we've seen in politics the past few years, if you already were positive toward Biden, you will come out of this loving him more. If you had any reservations about Biden, you will come out of this being very, very wary of his administration. I don't think this would be a move that's promoting unity at all in a pretty politically tenuous time for our nation. I think politically it's not a good thing. And I would be curious to see what the implications would be for smaller businesses. Large corporations, they can top-down mandate it and just they can either eat the cost or they can just can people whenever. But smaller businesses where people are integral, if they decide to leave, I don't know if they would be able to handle that if someone did decide they didn't want to get vaccinated.
Josh, any thoughts in response to that?
I still think, even tying back to Marcella's point of like how this is a capitalist system and you have to work to eat, then it's not an unrealistic expectation of society, this mutual thing we're building to have a safe place to work. And, a vaccinated society is getting to that. I also think it comes down to remembering that there are people who can't get the vaccine and are, put out of basically where they're locked out of access to society that we all have access to because of their medical, conditions that are inherent about them, whether they chose them or not. And at some level, there's an aspect of like a civil rights issue. Part of the federal government's case against schools that have banned mask mandates is that it's a civil rights issue for students who are immunocompromised, can't get the vaccine, or too young to get the vaccine, that they can't be protected and go to school in a safe environment. And our government throughout the ages has had to take some pretty anti-unity, pretty strong-armed authoritarian actions to impose efforts to make sure society was equal for all of its members. When the same states that are now refusing to help get their populations vaccinated, when those same states refuse to integrate their schools, we sent the army, the actual army, to go there and mandate a town comply with a legally authorized federal order. And that's why I think the idea of legally authorized will come up in the courts. But the idea that people's access to society and the idea that they deserve to live in a fair fair world that's not going to discriminate against them for their medical conditions has to be taken account of, like, what we expect out of our government to do, and like, why is it to exist if not to help provide an equal ground for Americans and not to use its power to make that happen when it needs to.
I think the rhetoric that Biden's giving in this last speech winds up directly undercutting that, because the vaccines are effective. We know that to be the case. Not only does it reduce your likelihood of getting and spreading COVID, if you do happen to get it and you are one of those breakthrough cases, it's a much milder case and you're almost guaranteed not to die if that were to be the case. And to say that the reason for what many are going to be calling an authoritarian move on his part is because those of us who have the vaccine are at risk is going to cause people, if they think about it, to question, okay, well, if I'm mandated to get the vaccine and I'm still at risk, then how is that going to wind up improving the situation of the people that you mentioned, Josh, where they're at risk regardless? Like that, I think that his rhetoric there winds up undercutting the efficacy of the vaccine and selling it short of what it can actually do, particularly with the way that it kind of cuts against the grain of what's actually the case. The people who are at risk are those who are unvaccinated, and that will remain true.
Right, but the people who have breakthrough cases and die are largely 65 plus. And among our elders and community, and the federal government has a civil rights mandate to not let discrimination, age-based discrimination, occur in this country. It is the civil rights of people 65 and older that they have the same, reasonable expectation of access to Walmart as the rest of society, the reasonable expectations to their places of work as the rest of the society. And to say, that, sure, it's only a select few of you are dying, but that's to turn to those people and patients who are dying and people who we could help if more people were vaccinated and say, your civil rights, your life, you don't matter. And I think that's a strong statement of our government to make in consideration a policy of saying, at what point am I willing to trump someone's, political, partisan take for the sake of another human being and their right to be a member of our society?
Austin, thoughts?
I think I'm all right for this segment.
I don't know. I guess, Josh, kind of one of my responses to that would be that, there's many, many things that are harmful to people. I mean, obesity, heart problems. Like there's many, many things that can cause numbers of deaths. And I will never agree with that leading to an overstepping of the governmental bounds. I think that there's specific emergency instances where that happens. I think that the Brown versus Board of Education instance where they sent in the military was an example of that. I think that when we've seen example cases of this, even through COVID, which is more recent history, I think that that remains true, that there will be instances where the federal government has that interest. I'm just not seeing that line up in this particular case. And again, all of this is even assuming that this goes through and doesn't get struck down. Realistically, to kind of go back to Marcelo's question, my answer to that is only if this happens to go through. I don't see this happening. I see at the state level, you'll have not only suing of the federal government, which is precedent and can happen. Whether or not they'll win is another question, but it can happen. The people can sue. I think that you'll just have non-compliance. I think that you will have individuals who not only take this to the Supreme Court, but businesses who just say, you know what, OSHA requires me to report it. Short of them actually showing up and auditing us, this isn't going to be a thing. So realistically speaking, I don't even think this is going to be enforced. I just have a problem with the precedent that President Biden is setting by doing this.
Then I don't really understand what the problem is. I mean, yeah, okay, I understand that, he's doing it in a way that, he probably should have asked every single American, should I do this or not before doing it, whatever. But I guess my point is that if it's going to get struck down, if it's going to get sued into oblivion by every other state, if at the end of the day, this attempt at a mandate makes at least like 3 more people getting vaccinated, that makes me happy. Like I'll be like, yeah, like let's do it. And that's, I guess that's my point, is because my ultimate goal is not to preserve someone's freedom to be sick. My ultimate goal is to preserve people from being sick and by default from getting vaccinated. And I guess in this case, the outcomes of the mandate are nothing but positive for me.
I think you're definitely seeing, particularly from President Biden's perspective, that I'm sure he shares the same thing, which is why he does that. I think that the different perspectives and how those are held on the court and what the precedent is will really determine that. Before we move on to hot takes, any final thoughts from anybody? All right, we will be right back with our hot takes. All right, we're back.
I already mentioned this before, but my hot take for today is that even if I just said that I love the vaccine mandate and I wanted to see it implemented, I also think it's in some way ironic that it's the purpose behind the vaccine mandate, which is to people making them get vaccines, is powered through the threat of you being without a job. Like it's basically the government telling you, like, if you don't want to take this vaccine, you're gonna get fired. Then your job is going to like suffer. Your boss is gonna like fire you or cut you off in some way. And to me, that's like really interesting because it cuts deeper into the reason why we're here in the first place, which is the government is not giving us enough aid to survive during the pandemic. And I hope I'm not shifting the ground here, but to me, it's like, yes, while I love the idea of the vaccine mandate specifically, like I would love to see it implemented, I also can't help but think that this is the government basically embracing the idea of like, if you don't work, you starve. And because we know you're going to starve if you don't work, we're going to make you do this or else, and there's no else because you're going to have to do it. That's my prediction. If this goes through, then it's going to be very effective, just simply based on the threat that it presents.
All right, so my hot take is going to be that, number one, this is unconstitutional. I think that President Biden oversteps the bounds. I think he oversteps the enumerated powers, that separation, and undercuts it with the way that he's chosen to do this. And I know that we've heard a lot in this discussion about all of the good reasons to do this. Go back and listen to our episode on COVID passports. You'll hear that we had unanimous agreement over the fact that vaccines work and that they should be used. And we recommend that you take them if you are, if your health history does not prevent that from happening. But this executive order winds up making this an authoritarian move that undercuts that delegation of powers to the states. And that'll come to my second hot take, which is that this should be left to the states. It's particularly troubling to me that President Biden winds up saying that he will do everything in his power to get those who stand against him out of the way. Regardless of whether or not you think the vaccines are good, they work, and they should be used, it should also be particularly troubling to you that the president of the United States is trying to undercut the powers that were not delegated to him. Federal government has what was left to them specifically, and then the states get the rest of it, which means that as much as it might go against what you believe, the states have to fail on their own. If you don't like it, you can move. The point where my state overrides that, I will do my best in that instance to move. So I think that the powers of separation is an important thing to uphold. President Biden doesn't have the constitutional power to do this. And my big takeaway from this is that it has to be left to the states. You can't overstep regardless of the end you're trying to achieve.
I'm going to disagree with Ryan. I think this is perfectly constitutional. OSHA is a federal regulatory agency, has broad power to oversee the workplace safety, but it's, occupational safety and hazard authority or agency. I forget what the actual acronym is in, other than occupational safety. They have tons of rules. There can't be an excess amount of radiation at your workplace. There can't be things that are overly carcinogenic floating around the air. I worked at a chemical lab, and we had all types of very, very dangerous things that laid around. And there was a ton of OSHA rules and regulations about their handling, storage, what to do in case of spill, accident, cleanup. And all of that was overseen by OSHA to make sure everyone that worked there at the company was safe and could do their job day to day, and we could be successful as a business. And so part of me does want to, looks at this as, if we're doing this as an emergency authorization to stop, a hemorrhaging of life here in America and to restabilize our economy as the coronavirus has continual impacts of our economic future and our social future, that this is well in the purview of the federal government to act under an emergency situation to provide care. There are people dying in ER waiting rooms and just suffocating on their own breath and mucus in their lungs. There are people who are having heart attacks and can't get seen by a doctor throughout their entire state. Our healthcare system, especially in the Southeast, isn't doing that good. If you get in a car wreck, there may not be an ambulance to come get you. You're more likely to bleed out in the road in a car wreck right now in Mississippi than an ambulance be able to get you and take you to an ER, because there's not an ER to go to right now. All of our ERs are pretty much coronavirus wings. And so if you have a stroke, you have a heart attack in Mississippi right now, you die. I'm not joking on that one. You die. Because the doctors can't get to you to help. And so there's a lot of compounding factors of what plays this into making an emergency, and also stress the fact that 1 out of every 500 Americans has now died from this coronavirus, over 600,000 deaths, and we'll probably see closing into 700,000 by the end of this year. How many lives have to die? How many people do we have to lose? How many students have to email me about a funeral of their family members for this to be a crisis and emergency that warrants the weight of our federal government to use the power of its occupational safety agency to make sure America can continue strong and healthy into the future?
For my hot take, honestly, I feel like I sound like a broken record on a lot of these, but when it comes to these centralized mandates from the executive branch, I've never really been a fan. Trying to be consistent, I really haven't been a fan, whether the mandate is something that I like or whether the an executive order is something that I find favorable. I don't really care for it, because they tend to, the more you centralize power and authority, the sloppier things get. The more heavy-handed, heavy-fisted they get, and you lose a lot of nuance. I think in light of some of the things I've been reading lately, I do think there is sort of a third way as far as it goes with employers. Instead of only having the options of getting tested weekly or getting the vaccine, I do think for people who have had the virus and recovered, there is also the portion of the equation of antibody testing. The vaccine itself is a means to an end to produce antibodies in your body. I think the more options that are available to people, I know this is about mandating vaccines, but I do think for the sake of the polity and everything else, I think that we should be able to have a few more things considered as far as the end of what a vaccine would produce or what having the virus itself would produce, and that is antibodies. So all of that boiling down to, I don't think the vaccine mandate was the way to go. I don't think these large centralized authority figures coming down on the American people is the way to go in such a divisive time. And I think that we need to take a step back and think about some of the implications that this sets as precedent.
All right. I'm sure you find yourself somewhere between the liars. Join us next time. Goodbye for now.